Okay, let's unpack this. We're launching into a deep dive today into South America, a continent where everything seems to be bigger, richer, more challenging, and infinitely more complicated.
It truly is a continent of extremes. And our mission today is to look past those common, often touristy images, the carnival, the Andes, the Amazon, and really leverage the rich source material you've shared.
Right.
We want to synthesize those nuggets of knowledge that reveal the continent's complex, intertwined history, its massive geographic and resource wealth, and the dynamic mix of peoples that define it today.
Essentially, we're aiming for the deep understanding of why South America is the way it is, moving beyond the stereotypes to get at the structural forces at play.
Exactly. And to start, we just have to internalize the sheer scale of the subject. Let's start with what we're calling the snapshot. South America is just massive, the fourth largest continent globally by area, clocking in at 17.84 million square kilometers.
And it's the fifth largest by population, with over 434 million people as of 2021. But what stands out immediately in those numbers is the immense concentration of power and wealth within a single nation.
The sources are crystal clear on this. You cannot discuss South America without addressing the dominance of Brazil. It's a really unusual regional structure.
How so?
Well, Brazil holds almost half of the continent's total land area, half of the population, and crucially, it generates half of the entire continent's nominal GDP.
Wow. So half of everything, basically.
Pretty much. That concentration means any regional stability or trade initiative is almost entirely reliant on Brasilia. It's not just a major power, it's the regional power.
It must create a kind of gravitational pull for the entire region.
It does, though it also naturally generates counter-movements from nations like Argentina or Venezuela that seek to temper that influence. So integration efforts are constantly complex. You can see that tension reflected in organizations like Mercosur and UNASUR.
Before we jump into the history, we should probably clarify the physical boundaries. It's bordered by the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Drake Passage to the south. But that northern border, it's always a bit fuzzy, isn't it?
It is. The official demarcation for continental South America is the Darien watershed, which runs along the Colombia-Panama border. But geopolitics frequently overrides physical geography.
Right.
The sources highlight that Panama, even though it's physically connected to the South American landmass through the Darien Gap, is almost universally grouped with Central and North America.
And what about the islands? We see a similar complexity there.
Yeah, take the ABC Islands, Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, and Trinidad and Tobago. Geologically, they sit right on the South American continental shelf, but culturally, politically, and economically, they're often classified with the Caribbean and, by extension, North America.
So to understand South America, you have to recognize these boundaries are political tools just as much as they are geographic realities. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The crucible of history and conflict. You just can't understand the modern economy or the political fault lines without going way back to its deep roots, long before the colonial shock.
We're talking deep time. The accepted theory places the earliest inhabitants arriving across the Bering Land Bridge at least 15,000 years ago. But what's fascinating is how quickly, or how early, they moved down the continent.
Which early sites are key here? The sources really prioritize one in particular, one that challenges that long-held Clovis first theory.
That would be Monteverde II in Chile. The radiocarbon dating there suggests human presence around 14,500 years ago, which proves that complex, organized human settlements existed in the far south of the continent.
Potentially before the traditional dates for the earliest human presence in North America.
Exactly. It just radically reframed our understanding of migration patterns and the speed with which the continent was settled.
And once settled, we see an almost simultaneous adoption of agriculture.
Indeed. Maize, the staple food of the hemisphere, was present in northern South America by about 6,000 years ago. But agriculture in the Andean highlands quickly moved beyond simple farming. By 2000 BC, you see these complex, settled agrarian communities developing sophisticated irrigation systems.
Which they needed to manage those arid coastal areas and steep mountain slopes.
Right. And domestication was key infrastructure. Unlike the rest of the world that had horses or oxen, the Andes domesticated the camelids.
Llamas and alpacas.
Llamas and alpacas, domesticated circa 3500 BC. They were crucial for three things: wool, meat, and transport. The llama was the pack animal that allowed trade and communication to exist across the rugged, high-altitude Andean terrain.
Without them, the later imperial road networks would have been logistically impossible.
Absolutely. We also need to pause and reflect on just how unique ancient South America was. It's one of the 6 sites where civilization originated globally, completely independently.
And that site is Caral Supe on the central Peruvian coast.
Yes, dated around 3500 BC. And what's incredible is that it's a pre-ceramic culture, meaning they achieved monumental architecture, centralized states, and extensive trade networks without the benefit of complex pottery.
That is just an astonishing technical achievement. How did they manage large-scale construction without pottery, which is often crucial for food storage and transport?
They used incredibly sophisticated methods of textile production, especially with cotton, and relied heavily on fishing resources alongside their farming. They built these massive platform mounds and circular plazas, which shows a clear hierarchy and the organization needed for a centralized state.
From this foundation, the Andean empires blossomed. The timeline moves through the spread of Chavin culture.
Right, from about 900-300 BC, and its religious and artistic influence laid the groundwork for later states like Moche, Nazca, Tiahuanaco, and Wari.
These weren't monolithic. They represented different forms of governance and expertise.
Very different. The Moche, for example, were masters of metallurgy and irrigation on the north coast of Peru. The Wari and Tiahuanaco were high-altitude empires that managed vast territories, sharing administrative techniques.
And we can't overlook the sophisticated non-imperial states like the Muisca Confederation in modern-day Colombia.
The Muisca were unique for their economic sophistication. They were renowned goldsmiths. They were the inspiration for the El Dorado myth,
Right.
But they were organized as a free trade confederation, what they called cacicazgos, rather than a single centralized empire. They managed this extensive commercial exchange across the harsh geography of the eastern Andes.
All of this culminated in the greatest expression of pre-Columbian South American statecraft, the Inca Empire, the Tawantinsuyu.
Which ran from 1438 to 1533. It was an empire on a scale comparable to Rome, managing 9 to 14 million people. And its political success lay entirely in its infrastructure.
That 25,000-kilometer road system.
Exactly, which was primarily for state communication and military movement, and it utilized that llama transport we discussed earlier.
And their engineering marvels, their cities built right into the mountains. What specifically made their stonework so unmatched?
It was precision without mortar. They developed something called ashlar masonry, cutting stones, often huge stones, to fit together so precisely that you couldn't slip a knife blade between the joints.
And that wasn't just aesthetic, right? It had a practical purpose.
Oh, absolutely. It was seismically resistant. It allowed their structures to survive earthquakes that modern concrete structures really struggle with.
It's incredible to think of such a sophisticated, centralized state being dismantled so rapidly. Which brings us to the collision, exploitation, colonization, and the shadow of slavery.
And that colonial project was legally defined by the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas. Spain and Portugal, with the Pope's mediation, essentially carved up the non-European world based on an imaginary line, a meridian.
But the measurement technology was so imprecise back then, meaning the agreement was immediately complicated in practice.
Very much so. While Spain got the west, Portugal's claim to the east, which initially only covered the narrow eastern bulge of Brazil, was massively expanded over time.
Because they just kept pushing west?
They did. Due to the lack of accurate longitude calculation and Portuguese determination, Brazil expanded its borders well past the original Tordesillas line, securing the vast territory we know today.
But the immediate consequence of contact was just demographic catastrophe.
A collapse of populations estimated at 90% in some regions within the first century. The native populations had no immune resistance to European diseases, smallpox, typhus, measles.
And this loss was then compounded by the brutal systems of forced labor the Spanish and Portuguese imposed.
The haciendas, those vast agricultural estates, and the reimplementation of the ancient Andean forced labor system, the mita. But now it was aimed at extracting silver and gold from mines like Potosi.
And that labor loss created the demand that fueled the Atlantic slave trade.
This is a crucial distinction. Enslaved Africans were imported en masse because they had developed immunities to diseases that decimated the native population.
We mentioned the scale earlier, but it really deserves emphasis. Nearly 40% of all enslaved Africans trafficked to the Americas went to Brazil.
An estimated 4.9 million people between 1501 and 1866. That just dwarfs the numbers brought to the U.S. and gives a powerful context to modern Brazilian demographics and social stratification.
The colonial powers also waged a cultural war. The Spanish crown mandated the conversion of natives to Catholicism,
which led to the destruction of priceless native artworks, especially gold objects, which were just melted down because they were considered pagan idols.
Yet amidst this suppression, the Catholic Church played a really complicated role in preservation, didn't it?
It did. For the purpose of evangelization, missionaries actively learned and formalized native languages. They often used Quechua, Aymara, and particularly Guarani in the Jesuit reductions to communicate the faith.
So they unintentionally ensured the persistence and even standardization of these languages.
Yes, protecting them from total linguistic erasure.
And out of this collision arose the mestizo class, the mixture of European and Amerindian ancestry, which forms the core of identity in many nations today. But the dark legacy of slavery persisted long past that initial colonial period.
Absolutely. While Chile was the first South American nation to abolish it in 1823, the institution lingered. To grasp the deep historical implications, consider that Brazil, responsible for the vast majority of the continent's slave imports, was the last country in the entire Western world to abolish slavery.
And that was in 1888.
1888. This late abolition meant the integration of former slaves into the economy was even more poorly managed and delayed than elsewhere, leaving a deep imprint on current wealth and social mobility statistics.
The move to independence in the early 19th century gave rise to the legendary Libertadores.
Simón Bolívar in the north, leading the charge from Venezuela, and José de San Martín, who famously led his army over the high Andes from Argentina to liberate Chile and Peru.
And their combined military efforts culminated in the decisive Battle of Ayacucho in 1824.
Which secured independence for Spanish America. Brazil's transition was a little smoother, avoiding the protracted wars of liberation.
It became an empire.
It transitioned to the Empire of Brazil under Dom Pedro I in 1822, essentially a negotiated independence from the Portuguese royal family, mediated by the UK. But once independence was secured across the continent, the 19th century immediately devolved into a century of painful fragmentation, border disputes, and shockingly bloody wars.
The Cisplatin War, for instance, between Brazil and Argentina's predecessor, was a mess that required external intervention.
It was a proxy conflict over the territory of the Banda Oriental. A stalemate, mediated by the British in 1828, resulted in the creation of Uruguay as a buffer state. It shows how regional powers were already carving up the geopolitical landscape.
But the sources single out one conflict as uniquely devastating, calling it a rare example of total war in the 19th century, the Paraguayan War.
The scale of this war from 1864 to 1870 is just hard to comprehend. It pitted Paraguay against the Triple Alliance Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, and Paraguay was absolutely devastated.
What were the losses like?
They lost 40% of their territory and an estimated 60% of their total population. To put that in human terms, the sources estimate 90% of the male population was killed.
90%. That is a societal catastrophe that defines modern Paraguay. How could they possibly recover from that?
Recovery was glacial and painful. It halted Paraguay's industrialization, which had been relatively advanced before the war, and created deep, long-lasting demographic and economic scars. It's a tragic testament to the destructiveness of unchecked regional conflict.
We also see the War of the Pacific, from 1879 to 1883, fundamentally reshaping the map.
It was primarily a conflict over nitrate-rich territories. Chile was victorious, annexing significant coastal land from Peru and, critically, leaving Bolivia entirely landlocked.
And that loss of access to the Pacific Ocean remains a core political and economic issue for Bolivia to this day.
It heavily constrains their trade options. Moving to the 20th century, the conflicts changed, becoming less about borders and more about status, like the naval arms race.
The dreadnought race.
Yes. In the early 1900s, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile engaged in this costly competition to acquire dreadnoughts, the modern, all-big-gun battleships.
And the sources provide a remarkable data point about the cost.
Argentina was spending almost a fifth of its yearly national budget just on the purchase of 2 dreadnoughts from the U.S. It speaks to the global geopolitical pressure and the desire for recognition, even if the financial cost seems absurd for nations still managing significant poverty.
Globally, Brazil held a unique military position.
Yes. Brazil is the only South American country to participate in both world wars. In WWII, they sent the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to fight alongside the Allies in the brutal Italian campaign.
And looking forward, the sources state that the last 2 international conflicts were the 1982 Falklands War between Argentina and the UK and the 1995 Cenepa War between Ecuador and Peru.
And the Cenepa War holds the distinction of being the most recent international conflict fought on South American soil. That fact that there has been relative international peace between states for nearly 3 decades is a striking contrast to the fragmentation and wars that defined the 19th century.
But the late 20th century was defined by intense internal conflict and political instability. The Cold War turned the continent into a geopolitical battlefield.
The 1960s and 70s saw the widespread emergence of military dictatorships across the southern cone: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay. These regimes, often supported by the U.S. national security doctrine, systematically overthrew democratic governments.
Which meant widespread political repression, torture, and the disappearance of tens of thousands of political opponents.
These events left profound scars. However, since the 1980s, we've seen a powerful wave of democratization, leading to the contemporary landscape that is defined by the so-called pink tide.
That shift, which began with Hugo Chávez's election in Venezuela in 1998, saw the election of numerous leftist and center-left administrations across the continent.
And this political shift has created serious momentum toward regional integration. The sources highlight key efforts: Mercosur, the Andean Community, and of course, a UNASUR.
The Union of South American Nations. What's the ambitious goal there?
The vision is enormous: to create a unified South American trade bloc that promotes the free movement of people, common economic policy, and even common defense initiatives. If it were ever fully realized, it would form the third largest trade bloc globally.
So what does this centuries-long history of mountains, rivers, and borders mean for the physical reality of the continent today? We move now to the geographic and climatic canvas, which, as you said, is simply defined by superlatives.
That history of conflict over territory, from Tordesillas to the War of the Pacific, was really a scramble for the physical riches of the continent. And the canvas those conflicts played out on is just immense. South America is a record holder in nearly every category of physical geography.
It's astonishing just how many global records are held here.
Well, consider the Amazon River. It is not the longest, but it is the largest river in the world by volume. It discharges more water than the next 7 largest independent rivers combined.
Wow.
It single-handedly accounts for about 20% of the total river water entering the world's oceans. The scale is almost mythological.
And the landforms are equally dramatic. We have the longest mountain range, the Andes, stretching over 7,000 kilometers, with Aconcagua, the highest peak outside of Asia.
And then we get to the climatic extremes. You can find the world's highest uninterrupted waterfall, Angel Falls in Venezuela, dropping 979 meters. Yet in the same continental mass, you have the absolute pinnacle of aridity:
the Atacama Desert in Chile, the driest nonpolar place on Earth.
It's a remarkable ecological paradox. Parts of the Atacama have literally never recorded rainfall since record-keeping began. The high elevation and the extreme cold of the Pacific's Humboldt Current create a rain shadow so effective that the desert floor is more like Mars than Earth.
And you contrast that with the opposite extreme, the wettest place on Earth.
Lopez de Miquel in Colombia, specifically within the Choco region. This area on the Pacific coast receives massive moisture flows off the ocean, with average annual precipitation that's just off the charts.
And the records continue into human habitation and hydrology. La Paz, Bolivia, is the highest capital city, and Lake Titicaca is the highest commercially navigable lake in the world.
The physical canvas is fundamentally defined by contrast. The West is dominated by the Andes, a massive geological barrier. The East, in contrast, is characterized by vast, fertile lowlands fed by those enormous river systems, the Amazon, Orinoco, and Paraná basins.
We mentioned earlier the complexity of the political geography. Do the sources help clarify the physical definition of the continent?
They confirm that physically, places like Trinidad and Tobago and the ABC Islands sit on the continental shelf. But politically, they operate in the North American sphere. And we also have to acknowledge the Pacific Island territories, the Galapagos and Easter Island, which, while governed by South American nations, are culturally and biologically often considered to have strong Oceania affinities.
Moving to climate, the tropical influence is dominant, naturally, given where most of the continent is located.
Right, and this is a major factor in global climate stability. The mass equatorial zone provides a persistent oceanic influence, which moderates temperatures year-round, resulting in less extreme seasonality in the southern cone compared to similar latitudes in North America.
The climate zones are exceptionally varied. The Amazon basin experiences a constant, hot, and highly humid equatorial climate.
But step south to the Argentine Pampas and you find a Chinese-type, climate-humid subtropical, excellent for agriculture. Then, if you travel all the way to the southern tip, to Tierra del Fuego, the sources classify the climate there as a Siberian type.
That seems counterintuitive. Siberia suggests intense land-based cold.
It's defined by the harsh, unrelenting maritime influence and the altitude, leading to permanently cold, wet, and windy conditions. It creates a subarctic environment despite its oceanic location.
What dictates the rainfall distribution? Why is the west so dry and the east so wet?
It's all about the Andes and the Atlantic moisture. The massive mountain chain blocks the Pacific moisture. However, the east is constantly bombarded by strong winds carrying moisture from the Atlantic, dumping enormous quantities of precipitation into the Amazon basin and the eastern slopes of the Andes.
So the Pacific coast of Colombia is an exception to that dryness.
It is the absolute exception. The Choco region is so wet because it receives direct, unobstructed moisture from the Pacific, which then hits the foothills of the Andes, creating intense orographic rainfall.
And we could touch on the oceanic currents that dramatically affect the coastal zones.
The cold Humboldt Current, running north along the Pacific coast of Chile and Peru, chills the air, leading to fog, low clouds, and extremely stable dry conditions. That's the primary driver of the Atacama's aridity.
And a fascinating meteorological fact. Why is the South Atlantic so rarely hit by tropical cyclones?
It's a combination of factors, but primarily strong wind shear and a less organized intertropical convergence zone over that part of the ocean. These conditions actively disrupt the formation of the organized circulation needed for hurricanes.
Finally, let's turn to the continent's incredible mineral wealth and biodiversity. The sources frame this as both a blessing and a curse.
The list of major resources is extensive. Gold, silver, copper, petroleum, iron ore, tin. This resource base generates immense income. But this concentration on primary exports is the classic setup for the resource curse.
Let's elaborate on that mechanism. How does it actively prevent diversification?
The core mechanism is economic distortion, often called the Dutch disease. When a commodity price, say, copper in Chile spikes, it brings a flood of foreign capital into the country. This capital drives up the value of the national currency.
Which makes everything else more expensive to export.
Precisely. Every other domestic industry like manufacturing or tech services becomes instantly less competitive on the global market. It creates a dependence on volatile commodity markets and hinders the development of a resilient, diversified economy. This is a core challenge that South America faces.
The other great wealth is biological. South America is one of the most biodiverse continents on Earth.
The sheer scale of life is hard to quantify. The Amazon rainforest alone is estimated to contain 10% of Earth's known species. This includes a unique fauna like the llama, the anaconda, the jaguar, and the colossal Titan beetle.
But the sources also contain a historical warning about the fragility of this life, pointing to a catastrophic extinction event.
They highlight the Quaternary extinction event around 11,000 years ago. South America suffered one of the highest extinction rates of any continent globally, losing an estimated 83% of its large mammals, its megafauna.
What sorts of animals disappeared?
Saber-toothed cats, gigantic ground sloths, all remaining native South American ungulates vanished. And while climate change was a factor, the timeline strongly suggests that the arrival of the earliest human hunters played a substantial role in this biological collapse.
Moving on to Section 3, dissecting the sources, the economic engine and infrastructure. The theme of extremes persists here, particularly in the disparity of wealth.
The sources are uncompromising. The economic gap between the rich and poor in South America is larger than on most other continents. It is a continent characterized by high growth potential alongside deep structural inequality.
The statistics are damning. The richest 10% receive over 40% of the national income in countries like Bolivia, Brazil, and Colombia.
While the poorest 20% often struggle to receive 4% or less, and this disparity is often traced back to historical land distribution patterns inherited from the colonial hacienda system.
Economically, the region saw a significant shift in its structure following the Great Depression in the 1930s.
That period forced a change in strategy away from pure agrarian exports. It spurred substantial industrial development, driven by import substitution policies, especially in the larger nations.
And today, the economic weight is overwhelmingly concentrated. Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Chile account for over 80% of the entire region's economy.
They possess deep industrial capacity, focusing on electronics, textiles, food processing, automotive production, and Brazil is an industrial behemoth, boasting the aviation giant Embraer, a global player in regional jet manufacturing.
Let's focus on one of the continent's most successful and globally significant sectors, its agricultural superpower status.
This is where scale truly matters. Brazil is a global farming powerhouse, acting as the world's largest producer of staples like sugarcane, soy, coffee, and oranges, but also unique items like guaraná and acai.
The source data emphasizes the regional impact on global markets.
South America collectively produces half of the world's sugarcane, half of the world's soybeans, and half of the world's coffee. Brazil is the driving force behind this, making the continent critical to global food security.
And they are equally dominant in livestock.
Brazil is the world's largest chicken meat exporter and maintains the second largest cattle herd globally, representing 22% of the world's entire herd.
Argentina has its own unique niche specialties.
They are the world's largest producer of yerba mate, the shared ceremonial beverage, and a major global exporter of soy, maize, sunflower seed, lemon, and pear.
Then we have the specialized high-value crops coming from the Andean region.
Chile has mastered high-value fruit exports, especially cherries and kiwi, leveraging its reverse season growing environment to hit northern hemisphere markets during their winter. And Peru has reclaimed its heritage crops, becoming the world's largest producer of quinoa and a top 5 global producer of avocado and blueberry.
Moving underground, the mining sector is not just important, it's strategically critical.
Chile and Peru are the copper and silver giants. Chile alone supplies about a third of global copper production, which is indispensable for modern electronics and energy transmission. Peru is a close second in both copper and silver.
But Brazil has strategic metals dominance in certain niches that are crucial for high-tech manufacturing.
That's niobium. Brazil concentrates an astonishing 98% of the world's known reserves. Niobium is essential for making extremely high-strength, lightweight steel used in jet engines and pipelines. This gives Brazil immense leverage.
And we can't forget the metals, critical for the clean energy transition.
Bolivia is a major global producer of tin, antimony, and tungsten. But Argentina, in its northern region, is a top 4 global producer of lithium, a fundamental component of batteries for electric vehicles.
And the glittering side of mining gems.
Colombia is globally renowned as the world's largest producer of emeralds. Meanwhile, Brazil is the largest producer of amethyst, topaz, and agate.
This immense resource wealth is also tied directly to energy infrastructure, which the sources note is dominated by one source: hydroelectricity.
The massive river systems make it inevitable. Most of the continent's energy is hydroelectric. Brazil, for instance, relies on it for about 60% of its energy needs. They co-own the colossal Itaipu Dam with Paraguay, which is still the second largest operating hydroelectric capacity globally.
In the petroleum sector, the sources highlight a stark contrast between two major players.
Brazil successfully invested its resources and became self-sufficient in oil in 2006-2007, and it is now the 10th largest global oil producer.
Contrast that success with the collapse of Venezuela's oil production.
Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, but due to chronic underinvestment and political instability, its production has plummeted dramatically. In just 4 years, from 2015 to 2019, production fell from 2.5 million barrels per day to just 877,000.
The potential wealth is just trapped underground.
Exactly. And the structural issue plagues potential projects everywhere. We mentioned Argentina's Vaca Muerta field.
The world's second largest natural shale gas deposit.
Yes, a resource that could fundamentally alter Argentina's economic future. Yet, its exploitation is severely hindered because the volatile economic policies deter the massive long-term capital required from international energy companies. It's the resource curse in action.
Meanwhile, Chile is looking skyward.
Yes. The extreme solar radiation in the Atacama Desert gives Chile fantastic potential for solar energy, potentially generating far more energy than the nation needs, creating future export capacity.
Moving to transport, the sheer geographic challenges, the Andes and the Amazon, have made transcontinental routes an engineering nightmare.
The physical barriers are immense. Historically, major continental links were rare. Modern efforts, like the Brazil-Peru Interoceanic Highway, are only now beginning to provide road connections across the continent, though they're often expensive and difficult to maintain.
What about rail networks?
Argentina retains the most extensive rail network in Latin America at 47,000 kilometers, though much of it is currently non-operational. But generally, the railway and fluvial sectors are still considered secondary to road transport.
And public transit in the densely populated cities requires innovative, high-capacity solutions.
The Buenos Aires Subte, opened in 1913, was the first subway in South America. Today, the São Paulo subway is the most utilized, handling over 4.6 million passengers daily. But we also see unique adaptations to the geography,
Such as Bolivia's aerial cable car system.
Mi Teleférico in the La Paz El Alto area. Because of the incredible change in altitude and congested geography, they built a network of aerial cable cars for urban mass transit. It's the longest and highest urban cable car system in the world, a brilliant location-specific solution. We turn now to Section 4, a cultural mosaic, the complex tapestry of demographics and identity that defines South America today.
The core demographic reality is defined by what the sources call the hollow continent. Despite the massive population, the interior remains vast and largely uninhabited.
The population is heavily concentrated along the coasts and margins, a legacy of colonial access points. The interior, the Amazon, Patagonia, and the Atacama remains very sparsely populated.
The population itself is defined by high levels of genetic admixture across the board, a blending of indigenous peoples, European settlers, and African slaves.
The specifics vary dramatically. In Argentina, for instance, European ancestry is typically 65–80%, with Amerindian ancestry between 17–31%. This reflects heavy immigration waves in the late 19th and early 20th centuries from Italy and Spain.
And Colombia shows extreme regional variability.
Absolutely. Depending on where you are, the Pacific Coast, the interior Andes, or the Caribbean, you can find sub-Saharan African ancestry ranging from 1% to 89%. The genetic landscape reflects the history of colonization and the slave trade.
As for major ethnic groups, people of primary European descent form the majority in Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, and they represent 43.5% of Brazil's population.
But the mestizo population mixed European and Amerindian ancestry is the largest single group in the majority of nations: Bolivia, Paraguay, Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Conversely, descendants of indigenous peoples like the Quechua and Aymara are still the majority in Bolivia.
The continent is a true global melting pot, attracting communities from around the world.
Brazil stands out, holding the largest Japanese, Korean, and Chinese communities in South America. But Lima, Peru, is noted for hosting the largest ethnic Chinese community in all of Latin America.
What makes the Guianas so unique demographically?
Guyana and Suriname have the largest ethnic East Indian communities in the region. This is due to the post-abolition colonial practice of importing indentured laborers from India to work on plantations, as these territories were administered by the British and Dutch.
The linguistic landscape reflects this history. Spanish and Portuguese are dominant, with approximately 200 million speakers each.
Yes, Spanish in most nations, Portuguese in Brazil. The Guianas are exceptions. Dutch in Suriname, English in Guyana, and French in French Guiana.
But the preservation of indigenous languages is a critical political issue, often achieving co-official status.
Languages like Quechua, Aymara, and Guarani are recognized as official national languages alongside Spanish in countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Paraguay. Guarani, in particular, is unique in Paraguay, being spoken by the majority of the population regardless of ethnic background.
And the small pockets of European languages persisting after waves of immigration are a humanizing detail.
They show powerful cultural isolation. Welsh is still spoken and written in the Patagonian towns of Trelew and Rawson, maintained by descendants of 19th century Welsh settlers. Even more striking are the German dialects in southern Brazil.
You're referring to Rio Grandense or Hunsrückisch.
Exactly. It's a regional German dialect spoken by descendants of 19th century German immigrants in isolated rural communities. They maintained the dialect, often to the exclusion of Standard German, because they were culturally isolated.
The religious landscape is less fragmented, being overwhelmingly Christian.
About 90% of South Americans identify as Christian, with 67.4% being Roman Catholic. However, this Christianity is not monolithic. We see fascinating syncretic and non-Christian elements blending in. African descendant and indigenous religions like Candomblé, Umbanda, and Santo Daime in Brazil are vital components of spiritual life.
And the specific histories of Guyana and Suriname create religious diversity unseen elsewhere on the continent.
They maintain significant Hindu and Muslim populations, again reflecting the history of indentured labor from South Asia.
We must now talk about culture. From tango to superstars, the musical contributions alone have fundamentally shaped global culture.
The richness is astounding. You have the vibrant vallenato and cumbia from Colombia, the sophisticated, often melancholy tango from Argentina and Uruguay, and the internationally dominant sounds of Brazil. The energetic samba and the cool, refined bossa nova.
The sources mention Carmen Miranda's role in popularizing samba internationally.
Miranda, with her iconic fruit hats, brought the exuberance of Brazilian music to Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s. While her portrayal was often criticized for stereotyping, she introduced millions to the sound of Brazil.
Literature hit its peak global influence with the Latin American boom of the 1960s and 70s.
This was a period when writers achieved global superstar status by pioneering magic realism. We're talking about Gabriel Garcia Marquez of Colombia, with 100 Years of Solitude, and Mario Vargas Llosa of Peru. Alongside them, poets like Chile's Pablo Neruda and short story masters like Argentina's Jorge Luis Borges reshaped world literature.
And visually, the plastic arts provide powerful social commentary.
Oswaldo Guayasamín of Ecuador used a powerful, often tortured style to represent the suffering and political oppression experienced by indigenous peoples. In sharp contrast, Fernando Botero of Colombia developed an instantly recognizable style portraying those voluminous, exaggerated figures in painting and sculpture.
Cuisine is another marvelous mosaic reflecting all those global influences we discussed.
It's a true fusion. The sources highlight the massive West African influence in Bahia, Brazil, visible in dishes that use palm oil and coconut milk, and the enormous Italian influence in São Paulo and Argentina, where pasta and pizza traditions are often more intense than in Italy itself.
And finally, the essential beverages that define communal life.
Pisco, the grape-distilled spirit, is a point of contention between Peru and Chile. Both nations claim its origin. But the most widespread ritual is the communal drinking of mate, hot brewed herb, and terra, cold, in Paraguay. It's a social ritual of sharing that symbolizes deep regional connection.
Let's wrap up this segment with sporting supremacy, which is arguably where the continent has its largest and most consistent global impact.
South America shares global football supremacy only with Europe, and its track record is unparalleled. The continent has produced the three most successful national teams in World Cup history: Brazil with a record 5 wins, Argentina with 3, and Uruguay with 2.
They hosted the first ever World Cup in Uruguay in 1930.
And they host the longest-running international tournament in the sport, the Copa America, since 1916. Football isn't just a sport here. It's a foundational element of national identity, often reflecting the regional rivalries we saw forged in those 19th century wars.
While football dominates, other sports are locally critical.
Baseball is massively popular in Venezuela. Rugby is experiencing significant growth, particularly in Argentina and Uruguay. And the continent finally hosted its first modern Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro in 2016.
That was an incredible journey, synthesizing the history, geography, economy, and culture of this massive continent. Let's summarize the key takeaways we pulled together.
The core narrative of South America is one of astonishing potential, established by the rapid rise of pre-Columbian civilizations like Caral Supe and the Inca Empire, which were then fundamentally derailed by external shock and brutal internal friction.
We saw that shock manifest through the catastrophic demographic collapse due to disease, the geopolitical scramble defined by the Treaty of Tordesillas, and the brutal, lasting legacy of the slave trade, which ended latest in the Western world in Brazil in 1888.
That historical foundation translates directly to the modern economic structure. We established the continent's strategic importance as an agricultural superpower, dominating global production in soy and coffee, and its critical role in global supply chains through mining, providing indispensable resources like Chile's copper and Brazil's niobium.
But those riches come with a significant cost. We highlighted the persistence of internal challenges, the massive wealth gap, the richest 10% often holding over 40% of the income, and the infrastructure difficulties imposed by the immense geographical barriers of the Andes and the Amazon.
The knowledge we've gained allows you to now connect the dots. You can see how historical actions, like the fragmentation of the 19th century that led to devastating conflicts like the Paraguayan War, still influence modern political identity, and how that economic specialization, driven by commodity reliance, leads directly to structural problems like the Dutch disease.
You now understand that the continent has navigated a dramatic shift from a 19th century history defined by bloody wars to a post-1900 era of remarkable international peace between its states.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. Despite this long-standing commitment to international peace, a striking and often overlooked achievement, South America has consistently been hindered by its heavy concentration on a few major commodity exports. This economic dependence generates the political instability that prevents full capital investment.
So if the continent could finally overcome this structural political instability, the kind that stalls the exploitation of enormous resources, like Argentina's Vaca Muerta shale gas field, and truly realize the promise of regional integration, like the goals of UNISUR, could leveraging its natural resource base finally unlock its vast untapped potential.
It's a fundamental question of whether the political will of the present can truly overcome the geographic and historical constraints inherited from the past.
Indeed. Something to think about until our next deep dive.